Few names evoke as strong an image of the American West as Fort Laramie. Because of its unique location, Fort Laramie witnessed the entire panorama of the Western adventure. From the Native Americans who for centuries relied on the mountains and the plains to provide them with all of their cultural needs, to the coming of the first Europeans, the mountain men and the fur trade, the emigrant wagon trains, the clashes of cultures, and the range cattle industry with the cowboys whose weathered faces mirrored the crustiness of the sagebrush and prairie grasses where they spent their lives. This queen outpost of the frontier saw it all. Located in southeastern Wyoming, at the confluence of the North Platte and Laramie rivers, near the present town of Torrington, Fort Laramie became one of the largest military posts on the western frontier. The first structure to be built in this area was a log-wall trading post erected in 1834. It was named Fort William after its founder, William Sublette. Fort William was primarily a trading center for the Plains tribes, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who would barter their buffalo hides for trade goods. 2 years later, the post was acquired by the American Fur Company, and in 1841, it was replaced by a larger adobe structure which was built on a nearby bluff. It was named Fort John, in honor of one of the company's officers. But this fort, as well as Fort William before it, had another name, a name that finally stuck: the Fort on the Laramie. Fort Laramie became a star witness to one of the greatest movements in American history, the Western Migration. It was a focal point in the historical period sometimes referred to as Manifest Destiny, the period when many Americans believed that it was their duty, their destiny, to control and colonize all of North America. Emigrants and missionaries from the East stopped at Fort Laramie while traveling westward on the Oregon and Mormon trails, and those who answered the clarion call of gold in California. The Oregon-California Trail was one of the longest and busiest of the emigrant trails, taking pioneers 2,000 miles across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains to Oregon and California. For most, the long journey began on the Missouri River, where crowded steamboats would take them to Independence or St. Louis, Missouri, where they could purchase supplies and link up with westbound wagon trains. For over 20 years, emigrants battled the harshness of prairies and mountains on a journey that could take 5 months to complete. It is estimated that from the beginning of the 1840s to the early 1860s, more than 20,000 people died along the trail. Most succumbed from accidents and disease, usually cholera. Very few, less than 2% in fact, were killed by Native Americans. Fort Laramie was located about 1/3 of the way to Oregon, a welcome sight for tired people and animals. They could rest here, purchase needed supplies, and repair wagons and other equipment. For most emigrants, Fort Laramie was the first sign of civilization in more than 300 dusty trail miles. A cultural and an emotional gathering place, where even for a short period of time, the loneliness of life on the trail could be left behind. But the toughest part of the journey still lay ahead, with high mountains and rocky, swift-running streams posing life-threatening obstacles for both people and animals. In 1846, while the migration to Oregon and California was increasing almost daily, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints started their own migration from Nauvoo, Illinois. It was February. The rivers were laced with ice. The trails were buried beneath deep snowdrifts, and the icy, bone-chilling wind tested the strengths of both humans and animals. A winter camp was set up near the site of the present city of Omaha, Nebraska. The winter was so severe that many people became sick and died. When the weather broke in the summer of 1847, their energetic and powerful leader, Brigham Young, guided his people to a new, unsettled land in the Utah Territory, near the Great Salt Lake. In the months and years that followed, their route became the Mormon Trail, and they too relied heavily on Fort Laramie for rest and supplies. With religious persecution behind them and the promise of new life ahead, Fort Laramie was as welcome a sight to the Mormons as it was to the other pioneers. After leaving Fort Laramie, both the Mormon and Oregon trails ran together, following the North Platte River across what is now central Wyoming. They crossed the river at a site near the present town of Caspar, where the Mormons started operating a ferry to take people, wagons, and animals across the rain-swollen river. A trading post, a stagecoach station, and a small army post were established here. After crossing the Sweetwater River, the trails separated on the west side of South Pass, with West Coast travelers continuing northwestward into Oregon and California, and the Mormons trekking in a southwesterly direction to the Great Salt Lake, where they established Salt Lake City. During the peak years, 1849, 50, and 51, it is estimated that more than 50,000 people with their wagons, teams of oxen, mules, horses, cattle, and even sheep visited Fort Laramie annually. As the volume of traffic grew steadily, Native Americans began to harass wagon trains more frequently. The government decided to establish military posts along the emigrant trails to ensure safety and provide supplies for the travelers which were bound for the Western Territories. Accordingly, in 1849, the Army purchased Fort Laramie from the American Fur Company for $4,000 and immediately began construction to enlarge the fort. When Company E of the new 1st Regiment of Mounted Riflemen arrived at what was now officially designated Fort Laramie, it ushered in 40 years of service in the U.S. Army. The Army's version of Fort Laramie was much larger than either of its two predecessors, and by 1888 it had become as large as a sizable town. The open stretch of land in front of Fort John, where visiting Native Americans once camped, became the parade ground and was surrounded by a variety of buildings. In 1851, 1866, and again in 1868, Fort Laramie was the setting for the most important treaties between the U.S. government and the Plains tribes. One of the more famous civilians to visit the new fort was frontier scout Kit Carson. In his diary, Carson recalls visiting Fort Laramie in 1850, shortly after it became a military post.
On May 5th, 1850, Tim Goodell and I started to Fort Laramie with 40 or 50 head of mules and horses to trade with the immigrants. We arrived about the 1st of June and remained there about a month, disposed of our animals to good advantage.
Carson said he returned to Fort Laramie in 1853 while driving 6,500 head of sheep from New Mexico to California. During those early years, Fort Laramie's garrison was small, but a tragic incident in August of 1854 would soon change that. Second Lieutenant John Grattan left the fort with 29 men and rode 8 miles down the North Platte River into a Sioux encampment to arrest a warrior for slaughtering an emigrant's cow. A fight broke out, and Grattan and his entire command were killed. As a result of this incident, the fort's garrison was expanded, although it still remained relatively small by Army standards. In 1859, Fort Laramie became an important stagecoach stop. The Pony Express came through in 1860, followed by the telegraph in 1861. When the Civil War broke out, traffic on the Oregon Trail diminished to almost nothing. There was, however, a new attraction: gold. In the early 1860s, the discovery of gold in south-central Montana, which was then part of the Idaho Territory, quickly attracted hordes of prospectors, along with many others who were eager to take advantage of this new opportunity. Fort Laramie was their last major stop before the final northward push into Montana. After leaving Fort Laramie, many gold seekers ventured over a new route pioneered by John Bozeman. The Bozeman Trail branched off from the Oregon-California Trail near present-day Caspar, Wyoming, and wound northward through the Powder River country to the Montana gold camps. The story of the Bozeman Trail is a brief and troubled chapter in Western history. The trail took emigrants into the sacred hunting grounds of the Sioux and Cheyenne, who were determined to fight to keep it. But an equally determined government established 3 army posts along the Bozeman to protect the route: Fort Reno, near the southern end of the trail, Fort Phil Kearney near the center, and Fort C.F. Smith at the north end nearest the gold camps. On December 21, 1866, a large group of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, including a young brave named Crazy Horse, scored a stunning victory by wiping out Captain William Fetterman's 80-man command in a battle near Fort Phil Kearney. Word of the disaster was carried to Fort Laramie by John Portuguese Phillips. Phillips' ride, which has been much exaggerated over the years, is commemorated by this marker near the front of Fort Laramie's most prominent structure, the former bachelor officers' quarters known as Old Bedlam. The Laramie Treaty, which was signed in 1868, resulted in the closure of the Bozeman Trail to emigrants, declared that the Black Hills of South Dakota was off limits to white activity, and ordered the abandonment of the route's 3 military posts. But the clash of cultures was far from over. In 1874, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills would bring prospectors back to the region, despite the 1868 treaty. Because of its strategic location, Fort Laramie was the key post in protecting the Black Hills from illegal entry by whites, and monitoring activities at the nearby Red Cloud and Spotted Tail Indian agencies. In 1877, the government negotiated a new treaty with Native Americans, and the Black Hills were reopened for prospectors. But many of the Sioux remained hostile toward emigrant settlers. Fort Laramie would play an essential role in the campaigns and battles that sought to eliminate Native American resistance on the northern plains. The post served as a military marshalling point for the campaigns of the 1860s and 70s. Many troops from its garrison participated in those campaigns. And though no major battles occurred at Fort Laramie, detachments operating out of the fort recorded 51 encounters with Indians during the 7-year period from 1869 to 1876. Fort Laramie itself was attacked only once, in 1864, when about 30 warriors rode into the compound and drove off the cavalry horses. No one was hurt. The erection of a permanent bridge over the North Platte River near the post virtually assured Fort Laramie's continued importance as a center on the great overland migration route. This iron bridge replaced the original wooden structure in 1875. Today, the more modern bridge carries automobile traffic across the river and provides a valuable habitat for a large colony of swallows. Throughout the 1870s and 80s, Fort Laramie continued to evolve as a military establishment. New buildings were added, steadily increasing the size of the post. The arrival of the Union Pacific Railroad at Cheyenne in 1867 and the establishment of the supply depot at nearby Camp Carlin improved the Army's ability to keep Fort Laramie well provisioned. Army life on the far western frontier was never a glamorous or exciting experience. Mostly it was characterized by drudgery and boredom, punctuated by drill, patrol duty, and work details. Occasionally, these duties were interrupted by the rigors of a field campaign. Because it was a large post to begin with, and because it was located close to a major supply depot, the troops at Fort Laramie fared better than many of their comrades at more remote locations. Even at that, it was not without its problems. Sanitary conditions at Fort Laramie were horrible through the late 1870s, and many illnesses, especially among children, were reported. Pleasures and conveniences were few. Soldiers spent much of their free time and most of their money at the sutler store, the 19th century version of the PX. Sutler was the name given to an individual who followed an army for the purpose of selling food and liquor to the soldiers. The name sutler comes from an old Dutch word meaning to do dirty work. Later, when the government required sutlers to be licensed, they became known as traders. In addition to a store, Fort Laramie's trader also operated an enlisted men's saloon, which served both soldiers and civilians, an officers' club featuring a variety of wines, champagne, whiskey, and beer, and a card and billiard room open only to officers and their wives. The post office was located in the trader's building. With the sutler once being regarded as a second-class citizen on an army post, the third-class citizens resided just outside the fort at a place called the Hog Ranch. The Hog Ranch also offered tobacco, food, and drink to the troops, but better than that, it featured girls. The soiled doves who worked here were said to be the bottom of the ladder and looked it, hence the name Hog Ranch. Extracurricular activities for some troopers, whether on post or off, meant harsh disciplinary action. This dismal old guardhouse was built in 1866 and still stands today. Soldiers who were jailed here were in for a very uncomfortable stay. The more unruly prisoners would be shackled, and many faced severe and brutal treatment.
I don't care whether you put him in leg irons and both balls, or whether you don't, but I don't want to see him loose on this post again.
Sergeant of the guard.
Nothing visible, sir.
All right. Take both of his arms on both ends. Sergeant of the guard, put him on this ball. He may run with the little one, but he will not run with this one.
Guaranteed. Remember this one with the...
After you have him in there,
It's not...
Corporal of the Guard, bring in a couple of men here. We have to show this man that he can behave like a soldier.
Seize this man!
Take him back to
Take him to the guardhouse!
Later in 1876, a new guardhouse was built. It was larger and less medieval, however, than the old guardhouse. When the new guardhouse was being restored by the National Park Service, the work crews uncovered the foundation of the fort's first guardhouse, which was built in 1851. It contained 5 solitary confinement cells. Although soldiers were generally single and living far from home, posts like Fort Laramie were not without their own family communities. Most of the women were married to officers and spent much of their time at sewing bees and tea parties. But some enlisted men had wives and families with them as well. Their wives often took in the post's laundry and baked to earn extra income.
Remember, I get paid $1 a month to wash these for the soldiers. I wash clothes for 19 men, so I get $19 a month. That's a lot of money. Soldiers only make $13 a month, so I make a lot more, but all they do is walk around all day. I work. This is work.
Enlisted men had to have special permission from the commanding officer to marry. Menial tasks aside, however, all Army wives were highly regarded and treated with respect, as the soldiers were bound by a strict code of conduct. Despite the hardships, most women took great pride in their appearances, and there was always time to fuss with hair and makeup. Soldiers on the frontier saw many changes over the years, such as the replacement of the slow and cumbersome percussion muzzle-loading rifle of the Civil War to the more rapid-fire breech loader. During the summer, visitors to Fort Laramie are treated to demonstrations of the specifications and differences in the two weapons. The percussion muzzle-loader used a paper cartridge, a mini ball, and 60 grains of black powder. It had a range of 200 to 300 yards, but even the most experienced rifleman could only load and fire it 3 times a minute. The muzzle-loader was fine for the Civil War, where both sides fought with essentially the same weapons and tactics. But it was not effective in battles against the Native Americans of the Western Territories, who were excellent horsemen and warriors, and gave even the most battle-hardened soldier a whole new set of challenges under fire. So in the mid-1860s, a breech block was milled into the top of the muzzle loader, making it a far more suitable weapon for the requirements of the Indian Wars. The breech loader fired a .45 caliber bullet and could be loaded and fired as much as 20 times a minute with an effective range of 600 yards. In Fort Laramie's firing demonstration, it is easy to see why the breech loader became the weapon of choice on the western frontier. The huge trees seen at Fort Laramie today are relatively new additions to the compound. During its most active days, the post contained very few trees. The commissary storehouse, which dates from 1883, houses the visitor center and museum. The museum features a large collection of guns, including this Gatling gun, a weapon made legendary mostly by Hollywood. The rotating barrels gave it rapid firing capability, but it was cumbersome and often unreliable. The museum also features many other interesting Fort Laramie artifacts. Fort Laramie's most prominent building is Old Bedlam, which was built in 1849 with lumber hauled in from Fort Leavenworth at a cost of $60,000. Looking like a southern plantation mansion on the western plains, it is today the oldest military structure still standing in Wyoming. Old Bedlam's 4 large apartments served many functions over the years, including bachelor officers' quarters and family quarters. Before the restoration of Fort Laramie began, Old Bedlam showed the neglect of abandonment. Today it has been restored to its appearance in 1852. And looks much the same as it did when Kit Carson passed through here the following year. In 1864, one of Old Bedlam's first-floor apartments served as the post headquarters. That's when Fort Laramie's garrison was made up largely of volunteers, with the principal unit being the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William O. Collins. Colonel Collins and his wife occupied the apartment above the headquarters. They had only to step out onto the upstairs porch for a commanding view of their busy fort. Much of Officers' Row consists of empty stone and adobe walls, which now have been stabilized. The ruins date from 1883. They included 2 duplexes and the commanding officers' quarters, and were major additions to smaller adobe structures which dated from 1855. The enlisted men's barracks stood at the opposite corner of the parade ground, across from Officers' Row. Today, the infantry barracks are just bare foundations in the tall grass. The sounds of drill commands and marching feet have disappeared in the unforgiving prairie winds and crumbling stones which bore witness to history. But in officers' quarters, which remain, history has been painstakingly restored to specific periods in Fort Laramie's life, such as the Lieutenant Colonel's quarters, built in 1884. In 1887, it was occupied by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew S. Burt and his family during their second tour of duty at Fort Laramie. Their story is typical of many frontier families whose lives are tightly woven among the windswept prairie and crumbling walls. The Burts first came to Fort Laramie in 1874 from Fort Omaha, Nebraska. Captain Andrew Burt and his 9th Infantry, the Wakaheeps, as the Native Americans called them, arrived at Fort Laramie in June of that year. His wife Elizabeth and their 3 children reached the fort in August of 1874. Captain Burt met his family at the railroad depot in Cheyenne, 90 miles away. It would be the first time he would see his newborn son Reynolds, who was just days old. The trip back to Fort Laramie took 3 days, with Elizabeth and the children riding in an Army ambulance and camping in tents. They would take up residence in a small 6-room house on Officers Row, which at that time was called Doby Row, and was later replaced by one of the adobe structures which today lies in ruins. Reynolds was the youngest of the Burts' 3 children, and like his father, he would go on to complete a distinguished Army career. Both father and son would retire as brigadier generals. From her arrival in August of 1874 until leaving the post in June 1876, Mrs. Burt spent much of her time alone, since her husband was off on a series of campaigns and expeditions during those years. One of the most talked about expeditions came in November 1874, when Brevet Major Burt and a small contingent of troops escorted a group of scientists, workmen, and dignitaries into the Black Hills on a fossil hunt. Burt would later recall spotting a large fossilized leg bone called a trochanter one morning, which sent Professor Marsh into a frenzy.
The instant his eyes caught the object, Marsh wheeled his horse, dismounted, and rushed to what afterwards looked to me like the leg bone of an ox. Marsh dug around the specimen a while, then suddenly seemed to have gone crazy. He danced, swung his hat in the air, and yelled, "I've got him! I've got him!"
Elizabeth Burt noted that Professor Marsh and her husband returned safely to Fort Laramie, where the eminent scientist gave a talk.
Professor March gave us an interesting talk on his great success in this latest search for fossils in those Badlands, and the vast difference between that part of the world then and what it was in the Tertiary period.
The winter of 1874-1875 was the coldest on record at Fort Laramie, and, as Elizabeth Burt points out,
with good stoves and plenty of wood, we could keep comfortable in our living room at least. At night, it was impossible to make the dining room and kitchen warm. The precious sack of potatoes was covered with a buffalo robe and placed near the stove in the living room each night.
in the spring of 1875, Fort Laramie soldiers, including Major Burt, would escort another scientist into the Black Hills, Professor Walter P. Jenney, a geologist from the New York School of Mines. Rumors of huge gold deposits had prompted the U.S. Geological Survey to send Professor Jenney into the Black Hills to help determine if the area had enough value for the government to buy it from the Native Americans. Gold was indeed found in abundant deposits, but the government and the Native Americans failed to reach an agreement. President Grant ordered all Native Americans in the area to be at their respective Sioux agencies by January 31st, 1876, or face military action. For most, the order came too late, but the more determined chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused it anyway. So in late February that year, General George Crook mounted a winter campaign. Crook and Colonel J.J. Reynolds left Fort Laramie with troops and supplies, proceeding first to Fort Fetterman, which was located near the present town of Douglas, Wyoming, where they picked up more men. They left Fort Fetterman on March 1st, with 10 cavalry and 2 infantry companies and proceeded onto the Powder River, where they attacked a large Sioux Cheyenne village. Casualties on both sides were minimal, and for the troops, the bitter cold weather proved far more destructive than the battle. In the spring of 1876, all available troops at Fort Laramie were ordered to prepare for a summer campaign against the bands of Sioux and Cheyenne Indians who were still off the reservation. Elizabeth Burt recalled later,
We wives who were left behind knew the inevitable danger to all in the field. With aching hearts, we watched the soldiers march away while the band played. The girl I left behind me. So many times have I listened to that mournful tune played when a command marches out of garrison to take the field. This time we knew so well there was to be fighting to the death.
it was to be one of the largest campaigns against Native Americans ever mounted. The air was still crisp as cavalry and infantry troops left Fort Laramie and marched to Fort Fetterman, where they linked up with soldiers from several other forts. On May 29th, with General George Crook in command, the troops left Fort Fetterman and marched northward to the Rosebud. In all, more than 1,200 men, 120 six-mule wagons, and dozens of pack mules formed a column that stretched more than 4 miles. Major Andrew Burt commanded 3 companies of the 9th U.S. Infantry. It would be 4 months before he would return to Fort Laramie, and he would distinguish himself bravely in 2 hard-fought battles. The first occurred on June 17, 1876, when Burt and more than 1,300 troops fought a strong force of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors in the Battle of the Rosebud. The skirmish lasted for more than 6 hours with a surprisingly small number of casualties on both sides. In the face of determined resistance, Crook retreated to Goose Creek, the present site of a small park in Sheridan, Wyoming. Crook's failure to press on would drastically affect his plans to encircle the hostiles. Native American forces, meanwhile, headed northeastward to the Little Bighorn, where they joined forces with other warriors and annihilated Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and 267 members of the 7th Cavalry 8 days later on June 25th. Called the Greasy Grass by the Native Americans, this engagement would become the most famous Battle of the West, which popular histories would call Custer's Last Stand. And although it was a shocking defeat for the Army, the battle would live on in folklore, being featured in paintings and movies, all of which are inaccurate portrayals of what actually happened. Crook's forces would not receive official word of Custer's fight until July 10th. When news of the Custer disaster reached Fort Laramie, Elizabeth Burt said she and the other wives were filled with dread.
Naturally, we at Fort Laramie were a profoundly depressed collection of women. Letters were seldom received, and those of the most meager details, just brief and hurriedly written notes. You can well imagine how hard and sorrow-breeding it was to sit and think and imagine all kinds of disasters.
On July 10th, the Sioux instituted a scorched earth policy, setting fire to the Dakota grasslands, which meant that the tired and weak horses under General Crook's command would be without grass for grazing. The weather was hot and dry. The troops stripped down to the bare necessities as their food ran out. When a horse became too incapacitated to continue, it would be destroyed, and its meat would be distributed among the hungry men. On July 17th, the 5th Cavalry, which had visited Fort Laramie in June, had a small skirmish of its own at Warbonnet Creek in Nebraska. A contingent of troops charged a small band of Cheyenne warriors. During the brief exchange, the cavalry scout, William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, killed a warrior named Yellowhair, took his scalp and declared it the first scalp for Custer. Cody would reenact the incident many times for years afterwards in his Wild West show. On September 8, 1876, Crook's troops engaged a small but tenacious band of Sioux at Slim Butte, South Dakota. The battle lasted for more than 3 hours, with Andrew Burt and his tough infantry being credited for sending the warriors into retreat. When it was over, troopers recovered a 7th Cavalry guidon, leaving no doubt that at least some of the Indians they'd been fighting had participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On the 15th of September, Major Burt began the long trek back to Fort Laramie. The summer and early fall of 1876 was one of the toughest periods in Fort Laramie's history. The small garrison of troops who had remained behind at the fort during the Crook campaign were kept busy trying to capture Indian raiders and white bandits who were burning nearby ranches and stagecoach stations and killing peaceful settlers. Throughout that summer, Fort Laramie continued to serve as a key supply depot for hundreds of cavalry and infantry troops who were sent out on a variety of campaigns into the territories of the Northern Plains tribes. The post played host to several of the most famous people in Western history, including Buffalo Bill Cody, General Philip Sheridan, and Martha Jane Canary, otherwise known as Calamity Jane. In November 1876, while a few campaigns against the Sioux were still being mounted, the Burt family was transferred to another post and left Fort Laramie. Andrew Burt was a lieutenant colonel when he and Elizabeth returned to Fort Laramie in 1887. They occupied this cozy home, which today is one of the fort's most prominent restorations. By then, Fort Laramie had become little more than a resort. The toughest combat might be a spirited game of tennis or croquet, and days were filled with picnics, buggy rides, and lemonade. The Burts liked simple furnishings, and the family heirs have donated many of Andrew and Elizabeth's personal items as part of the home's restoration. A large white frame building at the south end of the parade ground was built in 1868 and is also a prominent restoration. It was originally intended to be the post commander's quarters, but instead was partitioned into a set of 2 quarters for 2 senior officers. One of the building's units has been restored to resemble a typical captain's quarters of 1872. The area behind it was the site of Fort John, erected by the American Fur Company in 1841 and demolished in 1862. This officer's duplex dates from 1875. It too has been refurnished with period furnishings. The largest building at Fort Laramie, and certainly a striking restoration, is the Cavalry Barracks, built in 1874. This huge building housed 2 companies of horse soldiers and has been painstakingly researched and restored to the way it appeared in the summer of 1876. Carbines ready to be picked up and carried into action. Bunks made neatly and ready to give rest to weary, saddle-sore soldiers who would return after spending months on the trail. Hats, sidearms, and rucksacks hung neatly at the heads of the bunks, with other personal gear stowed in blue footlockers. All that's missing are the reverberating sounds of dusty boots stomping on the wooden floor and the laughter and voices of troopers returning from a drill or campaign. Their memories have all but faded. The cavalry horses were stabled in barns and corrals, which were located just to the north of the barracks. And looking like a castle on the hill, the ruins of the post hospital, built in 1873. Here, both military people and civilians were treated for everything from serious wounds and diseases to snake bites and minor ailments, where they could be patched up as quickly as possible and returned to duty. The 12-bed hospital contained a dispensary, isolation rooms, kitchen, dining room, and a surgeon's office, but it did not have an operating room or laboratory. In walking up the scenic path to the hospital, one might take a moment to pause and try to visualize just how busy the doctors and nurses must have been here during the 1870s. During that decade, the post became even more critical to keeping the peace in the West. Old structures were replaced by larger and more modern ones, and many new buildings were added to the fort's compound because it was expanded to meet an increasing need. And while Fort Laramie was still primarily a military reservation, it also received heavy use by civilians, especially the freighters who brought their wagon trains through here while taking supplies to the mining camps and other settlements in the Black Hills. In 1889, the government decided the post was no longer needed and ordered it closed. In 1890, the buildings were auctioned off for a total of $1,417. By this time, many of the fort's buildings were already in a state of ruin. Some of the remaining structures were dismantled, and the wood was used on ranches and towns nearby, while others simply fell apart. When the National Park Service took over in 1938, a massive restoration project was put into operation. Converting these historic old structures from this to this has not been an easy task. It has taken years of research and hard work, all of which was highlighted in 1988 at a gala celebration marking Fort Laramie's 50th year as part of the National Park Service, and recognizing the site as one of the finest fort reconstructions in the United States. During its 40-year history, from the fur trade, the Western migration, the growth of the U.S. Army, the Indian Wars, to peaceful resort, Fort Laramie saw it all. Today, the Fort Laramie National Historic Site stands as a living memorial to the spirit of the American West. Its monolithic ruins symbolize the rock-solid foundation upon which our nation was built. As you stroll among the ruins and restored buildings on the post, it might be well to take a moment and reflect on the men and women for whom this was the American dream, who contributed whatever they could in building and staffing a military post that became one of the premier stopping points on the Oregon Trail. You get a sense that Fort Laramie was created with great pride, that this was a place where boys became men and men became leaders, and that the families who lived and worked together here formed important legacies for themselves while building for us the future of a nation.